Thank you. Thank you so much for coming out today as well. It's a lovely day, and I feel quite grateful that you aren't all picnicking out with a little warm coat on. So I've been working on vampires as a side gig for quite a while. I'm actually, as Irene mentioned, an historian of East Germany, especially modern Germany, and got interested in vampires as part of my interest in 19th century child-rearing practices when I began to notice in the 19th century that with the advent of separate rooms for children no longer sleeping in parents' beds, that there were all of a sudden a bunch of child-rearing manuals about what was going to happen with these poor children sleeping off in another room where they're no longer under parental control. And one of the concerns was masturbation, one of them is being killed, and I began to look at this in terms of a rise of Gothic literature about vampires and sexual violation of girls always as well. And so that's what this comes from, is an initial asking myself what was going on in the 19th century, and then I started, as historians do, working back in history and got back pretty far. So what I'd like to do today is give a little bit of an overview of some of the historical moments that we have where we see vampires in society, and move up for some of the key moments we have throughout history and film and text, and then talk a little bit about, during that time, what are vampires really. Before I start with this, the official part of it, who knows anything about vampires? Anything? Yeah, tell me something. Give me something you know. Transylvania, right? Great. So that's where we have these myths of vampires originating, especially Count Dracula. Yeah, what else do we have? Vlad the Impaler. Everyone likes Vlad the Impaler. He turns out to really have been only a brief note in Bram Stoker's discussion about Dracula, and kind of an interesting inspiration for him, but nothing probably much bigger than that. What else? Huh? Garlic is really bad for them, right? What else? Silver bullets as werewolves, but silver crosses and silver chains are bad. What else?
They drink blood.
They drink blood, except for when they don't. Yeah, what else?
They don't like sunshine.
They
Don't like sunshine.
They don't like sunshine. That can be a problem, except for apparently sometimes in recent Twilight episodes. What else?
No image in mirrors.
They can't see the reflection in mirrors, except for when they also can. What else? They're immortal, yes, but we can still kill them. What else do we know?
Turn into bats and fly.
They can turn into bats and fly, right? Some of them. Go ahead.
You have to invite them in.
You have to invite them in for them in order to come into your rooms, right? So we all know these aren't real things, right? And yet we get pretty upset in our literature when they break the rules. One of my students actually get in really big arguments about whether or not vampires from Twilight or from Blade or from True Blood are actually real vampires or not. And I have to really say, well, what is a real vampire? So one of the things that I want to talk about today is that vampires live among us. They have for a very long time. We actually create them. Vampires are part of a genre of monsters, and monster comes from mostra, Latin term meaning a portent, to show us. And so one of the things that vampires and monsters in general do for us is to show us who we are and what our fears are. So my takeaway message for today is that we have perhaps always had and needed the undead to warn us about how to live. Far from being afraid of them, we should embrace them, for they serve to make us better humans. So I won't go back to the very beginning of time, but I will go look at some of the early tropes of when we have instances of the living and the dead working together. We have, in the medieval period, we have a lot of course, the role of the church is really important, traditions, superstitions, proper burial, following of rites. But we also have a responsibility to the dead, and they have responsibility to us. And one of the main tropes of this time period is the three living and the three dead. These are always stories of three dead people coming and giving a lesson to three living people about how they need to live. Sometimes the living people are perhaps the Pope and some other kind of world leaders. Often they're also just local peoples who are, sort of little stories, meeting them on the road. And these revenants, these returns from the dead people, are there usually to let those people know about how to live a good life. And they often have three lessons they have to tell them. So they're not blood-sucking, they're not out to be mean, but they are kind of scary, and they are really warning a lot. I'm going to make a big jump after that and go all the way up to what we, though, perceive as more modern versions of the vampires that are more familiar to us. I think that the influence of Lord Byron cannot be underestimated when we look at vampires. Lord Byron, probably you know this a little. My students have never heard of Lord Byron quite often, but I think maybe I can safely assume that many of you have heard of him and his writings and his poetry and perhaps his reputation even, right? He was once described as being mad, bad, and dangerous to know. He was the 19th century's bad boy. And Lord Byron became himself interested in vampire-like tales and actually writes a piece called the Giaour in 1813. It's a very, very long epic ballad based on one of his Bildungsreisen, one of his grand tours to the Ottoman Empire, and he becomes obsessed with Turkish tales of Muslim honor killings of young women who have been sexually violated. In this poem, and this is really it's hundreds of thousands of lines long. I dare any of you to finish it and come back and tell me all about it. This is the excerpt that talks about vampires specifically. And in the poem, a Venetian known as the Giaour, which is a Turkish name for infidel, fights a Muslim hero, Hassan, to avenge the death of the Giaour's lover, who was killed by Hassan, who fled Hassan's harem. Hassan speaks a curse against the Giaour, this foreigner infidel, that his spirit will be punished as a vampire. This was a very popular ballad poem, and it had a lot of influences far beyond Byron and the circle of people he was writing for. And in fact, Edgar Allan Poe often cited it as a piece that really influenced the way that he wrote horror tales after that. And we have even here this Delacroix's combat of the Giaour and Hassan, not quite one of his best known works, but really quite exciting battle piece. You don't see the vampire in here, but this idea that somebody can be punished for the way that he acts in life by becoming undead this is one of the first main modern examples we have of that. With increases in this tradition among Lord Byron and his friends of meeting and talking about European horror tales and hanging out together. You may or may not know, as I said, Lord Byron, bad boy of his time, the favorite party boy that everyone loved to get in trouble with and then complain about. He, in the summer of 1816, heads to the Villa Diodati on Lake Geneva, and he goes along with several different other a cast of characters who I'll talk about in a second. In this meeting, he goes, he's going to hang out for the summer, and he goes along with, I'll just give the rest of the cast of characters here. So here he is, one of his brooding moments. He goes along with Percy Shelley, known as Bis, who is Mary Shelley's husband. Lord Byron is quite obsessed with some of the writings that Bysshe has done, and he also admires Mary Shelley, and the two of them are invited to go along. And Claire is a half-sister of Mary Shelley and has had a baby by Lord Byron, and talks her half-sister, into getting her invited as well, with the idea that she'll be able to get Lord Byron back and bring him back to his right ways. It doesn't happen. And we also have John Polidori along, who turns out to be a really important person in this story. He is Lord Byron's physician, and he is also a wannabe writer. And our final one, who never gets mentioned, Matthew Gregory Monk Lewis, was a poet who doesn't, of him, we know the least amount after this. He seems to have been along for the ride, but did not have any really big kinds of stories that happened afterwards. During this haunted summer in this villa, it's a horrible summer at Lake Geneva. It's stormy, it's dark, the windows rattle, there's lightning, there's thunder, it's too cold to go outside, they're miserable. And so what does a bunch of young people in their 20s do, sitting around in a villa, drinking, hanging out, nothing else to do? They start telling stories to each other. And they pull out a book, The Phantasmagoria, and they start reading each other stories from this book in German that are scary horror tales, and they start scaring each other. And then they start doing things like putting sheets on each other and then trying to haunt each other's rooms. I mean, you can imagine the scene. I think of my students and how they would be, and I'm sure hilarity ensues, but also a lot of hijinks, a lot of screaming. And at some point, Lord Byron says to the group, okay, what we really need to do is come up with our own monster story. And there's going to be a humongous prize at the end. And we're all going to do this. And they all agree to write a big monster story. So two main things come out of this. One of them you're very familiar with, I suspect. Based on some of the Italian physicians Galvani's experiments, where he hooks electricity up to dead frogs that are able to jump through the area, Mary Shelley comes up with Frankenstein. Not using these kinds of ideas about electricity, bringing people back to life, playing God. And this, she describes in her diaries as she's writing this, being incredibly tortured. She can't write. She's never going to be a writer. She will never make it. And I'm always heartened whenever I read those passages, because I think, okay, I feel that way quite often too. So she made it, so maybe the rest of us might have a chance as well. And she writes, and she comes up with Frankenstein from this time period. And this is I think it's important to think about this in terms of the monster stories and the other vampire story that comes out of this summer, because it really is about dead things coming back to life and what happens when we play God. The other story that comes out is written by John Polidori. It's called The Vampyre. Now, as I mentioned, John Polidori has been hoping to become a writer, and he wants Lord Byron to really recognize his brilliance and tutor him. And he's his physician really with the idea that he can get to know him better and get some publishing contracts through this relationship. Lord Byron did not like his physician and found him very wearying and tiresome, and did not think he was a good writer at all, and he made a lot of fun of him. And in addition to making fun of him, he didn't follow Polidori's instructions for how to live healthily. So it was a double frustration for poor Polidori. And as Lord Byron is making fun of him, Polidori begins to start writing his own story about Lord Byron based on a vampire character. And it's with this moment, with this first short story that Polidori writes, that he bases on Lord Byron, that we have the first emergence of a vampire based on an aristocrat. So the vampire in Polidori's novel is described as being tall, having gray, flashing eyes. He dresses well for dinner every evening. He manages to seduce all of the young women, but only leaves them and abandons them afterwards. It's a very damning story about Lord Byron. And after the Villa Diodati, Lord Byron makes so much fun of John Polidori that Polidori leaves him and gets this piece published. And everyone, because it's so obviously based on Lord Byron, everyone assumes that Lord Byron has written it. Lord Byron is infuriated because Polidori publishes it anonymously. He's infuriated and says he would never write a piece of trash like this. It's so badly written, and the character isn't believable at all. And no one should read this, and he's going to destroy Polidori's reputation and make sure that this never has any serious audience. What happens is that because Lord Byron really says this is not worth reading and this character is not credible, no one who's that good looking and that famous could also be that bad. This is not based on true tales, of course. The Vampyre is translated into several languages at that point and becomes one of the most important pieces of work at the time. Polidori does not go on to write very much more, but it's a really important piece for the kinds of vampires that we begin to have. Our next one that I think is important based on this kind of popularity of Polidori, based on increasing literacy rates among the populace, based on increasing ability to publish at low cost. We have a series of what we call penny dreadfuls that begin to come out. Pulp paper, not very high quality, a printing job, not very well, not paying attention to the spelling, this kind of thing, quickly done. Sometimes they're published in serial forms in newspapers initially, and then perhaps come out as a bound volume. This is what happens with the Varney the Vampyre, attributed to variously James Malcolm Reiner and Thomas Pickett Prest. It appears in a serial form in a newspaper from 1845 to 1847, and then comes out as a pulp fiction book in 1847. Varney the Vampyre, or The Feast of Blood. It's very fantastic, it's very exciting, it doesn't have a lot of a plot, but it's got lots of blood. The vampires in here are again based on that kind of aristocratic ne'er-do-well who's you can't really get away from because he's so attractive. The departure that we have from this is from Sheridan Le Fanu, Carmilla. Le Fanu was an Irish author, and he published Carmilla also as a serial. In this book, the vampire, Carmilla, it's a young woman, befriends and tries to seduce the young woman, Laura, who has just lost her best friend to a terrible death. The reader learns fairly quickly on that the friend has died because Carmilla has killed her. Carmilla is much older than she appears to be. She's not just in her early 20s. She's actually a couple hundred years old. She's a countess. She's a vampire. And she comes back and befriends Carmilla. And Laura's father at some point realizes that Carmilla is actually not Carmilla, but Lady Marilica. It's a different spelling of it. And in an early version of a vampire hunter story, a team of vampire hunters led by a doctor and a police officer find Carmilla's living corpse, which is still breathing, and it's in a coffin, and they stab her through the heart and cut off her head. Laura never does, though, entirely recover, neither emotionally nor physically, which suggests also this tragic part of vampires having an influence on their victims long after they're gone, which is a new piece that we're going to see again and again, the influence of vampires even after we kill them. Carmilla is often referred to as the first lesbian vampire story. We could certainly trace homoerotic fiction back to this time period in general for lesbians especially, but it's incorrect, I think, to call it a lesbian love story. This wasn't the kind of language that they were using at the time, but there is and for the time period, you are reading between the lines always a little bit, but it definitely is a very sexualized love story. And there is, so it's one of my students always like a lot because they're so surprised that one of the main vampires is not actually about a man, but about a woman and her love for another woman. And it's very much Carmilla and Laura are pulling back and forth, and they can't resist each other, and they're bad for each other. In response to that, one of my students this past fall wrote what she considered to be a positive vampire lesbian love story. And I had to you were in this class the last 10 weeks, right? But you need you write the vampires that you need. So maybe a positive image is one that we need. And here we come to the one that everyone always knows, right? Bram Stoker's Dracula. If you haven't read Bram Stoker's Dracula, it's available online. It's easily, even an internet search, you can come up with an ebook of it. And I encourage you to start to read it again. I don't know that you'll have a better record of finishing it any more than my students did this past quarter. It's not that great of a book. It is, the plot's confusing. It leaves a lot of questions unanswered. The language is convoluted. It is long. It needed a good editor. And yet it was the right time and the right place. Dracula becomes the book that we most associate with the vampire myth because it picked up on a trend that was already in place. And because of the success of earlier versions, Dracula really becomes a piece that people then base further kinds, or believe themselves to be basing further kinds of novels off of, not realizing that they're actually going back to this much earlier time period, or to earlier periods, who then are the ones that are responsible for Dracula. The pieces that are interesting in Dracula, and I think are one of the reasons also that contribute to its success, is the very Irish and British Catholic Protestant fight that's also going on in this. Ideas about foreigners coming in and bringing in diseases, bringing in the wrong way of thinking, the wrong way of living. And if you think about London, which is where it's set in this time period, it also captures a lot of other kinds of fears going on. London is one of the world's most important harbors at the time. It is bringing in new ships all the time of scary foreigners from different lands, often from Central and Eastern Europe, and they're often buying property in London. The ships are stopped consistently at the harbor and investigated for diseases, for fears of the plague. So when you have a piece like Dracula with the Count who has bought property in London, right? Those scary foreigners always buying property in your cities. He's bringing literally foreign dirt. He is himself a disease coming to take over and make everything over in his own image. And there's absolutely, with the beginning with this novel, the beginning of clear xenophobia regarding vampires. That is new with this piece, the idea that vampires are from a different culture always and not from within your own culture. And also that they're coded as being Jewish. So the beginning ideas of somebody from Central Europe, from Eastern Europe, with their crazy non-Christian ways, crazy ways of being buried, of interacting with women, with sexuality, hypersexuality, breaking the law, and coming to perform a sexualized killing on you, this sort of penetration of the neck, drinking of the blood. And with these pieces, a lot of what we now associate as being rules about vampires, the garlic and the mirrors, become part of the modern vampire myth that we know. I don't want to suggest that Dracula is not as important as it was. It really is quite important for what we're doing with vampires, but it's just, I think, not the best one. But it does inspire one of my very favorite all-time films, Nosferatu, 1923, by F.W. Murnau. It's a silent movie, it's based very closely on Dracula, and it's an early example of the golden age of German cinema. And Max Schreck is Count Orlok. They have to change the name because the Bram Stoker copyrights group, his widow's representing group, says that they cannot use Dracula. They cannot set it in London. They have to change it. So they change it just a little bit. It's now called, he's now Count Orlok. It's called Nosferatu instead of Dracula. They moved the port city to northern Germany, to Wismar, but it's still the same story, of course. And we definitely see in this Orlok character the caricature of a Jew. He's got a vermin-like face, he has a pointy nose, he's got small eyes, he has bad teeth that you can imagine chewing or gnawing on something. He's hunched over, he has claw-like fingers, and here again, thinking of the idea that we need different vampires to represent the fears that we have of different eras. The 1920s are a period when xenophobia and anti-Semitism are on the rise in Germany, something that we'll see later on, and of course in the Nazi period come to its worst possible consequences in the murder of 6 million Jews. There's a remake of this, which I don't have on here, from the 1970s by Werner Herzog. If you're a fan of West German New Wave cinema, it's also an interesting one to look at. It's a little bit harder to get a hold of than this one. This one is readily available on the internet if you want to spend an evening watching a 1920s version of love, lust, seduction. The next main vampire craze comes out after World War II. I Am Legend by Richard Matheson of 1954 is fairly well received in this time period, and it's also another one that inspires further horror writers like Stephen King. Later on says this is one of the most important things that he had to write on. In I Am Legend, we have images of vampirism as an incurable disease that humans can contract and cannot do anything about. There is, as more and more vampires in I Am Legend become infected with this disease, the slow but steady realization is that humans have to kill them if humans are going to survive, because they keep getting infected. Vampires need to survive by feeding on humans, so bloodborne pathogens. And in the end, we have the inevitable conclusion that humans who were once the victims of vampires have now become the predators of vampires. And we arrive at a place in this post-apocalyptic world where humans are killing vampires, humans are in the minority, and they are now the monsters with their wooden stakes killing all of these vampires who cannot have helped becoming the monsters that they are. Humans are now the real monsters. And in the end, you have the protagonist in his cell looking out through the bars, realizing that these people that he once saw as monsters and was so afraid of, he now was their biggest monster, and he is the last man on Earth. I think that in a post-World War II period, when fears of a third world war are quite high, when the early news of what really had happened in concentration camps in the Second World War, I think it's hard not to see this novel as positioned in what happens when humans create things that then make humans themselves the monsters and their own victims in this interesting piece. If you're a graphic novel fan or a later movie fan, this I Am Legend becomes a movie that the series, that part of the series Blade, that Will Smith becomes an actor in, and it also has a little bit of a twist in the 70s and 80s with the idea that in the later version of the film, the the bloodborne pathogens are actually coded as being an HIV virus that leads to AIDS. And again, the people who have it are the victims of humans having tried to make things better, and then things go wrong. In 1972, I think we have a really interesting example also of a vampire, new vampire tropes. It's directed by William Crane, 1972, and it's one of the early blaxploitation films. And if you know anything about blaxploitation films, you know that this is in the 1970s, Hollywood begins to look around at other audiences that it could sell movies to, and realize that the African American community would like to see movies about itself. And these films are made on the cheap. They're at best B movies, sometimes C movies. They are popular, they're quick to make, they have low budgets, and they star some people who become quite famous in the acting world. William Marshall is Blacula in this film. It was a very popular film, and it's really also worth one taking a look at today. William Marshall plays an 18th century African prince, and he travels to see Count Dracula to request Count Dracula's help in ending the slave trade, which Count Dracula has a major part of. And he comes, this prince, Mamulada, comes with his wife and his retinue, and Count Dracula, instead of being impressed with Prince Mamulad's discussions of Enlightenment thought has now finally come to the New World, and the 19th century is now a time that we can no longer ignore. The 18th century and the 19th century are no longer times where we can ignore these kinds of things, and we have to emancipate those people who are our fellow human beings. Dracula makes fun of him. There's a very long scene in which he threatens to enslave Mamelud's wife, and the prince tries to attack Dracula, and Count Dracula counterattacks and turns him into a vampire and curses him, saying, "I will make you now Blacula for all eternity." He's locked in a coffin. His wife is left to die. And centuries later, in 1972, a gay couple who are furniture restorers and home decorators discover this coffin in this estate sale and decide to use it in this design that they're going to be doing, and then open up Blacula by accident. And he goes about then avenging his wife's death and has no memory of his earlier life at all. It's an interesting, entertaining piece that I really recommend, and I think that the combination of this rise of discussions of civil rights for African Americans that leads to a situation where a film made about African Americans for African Americans, maybe not for white audiences, but at least for African Americans, can take to task the idea that slavery is wrong, is part of modern day discussions that need also to happen, and also can have a humorous but also positive reference to a gay couple during the same time period. I think is an important piece of the civil rights discussions of this time period. Another interesting example of vampires being the ones that we need them to be to talk about and face our fears. The next year, we have Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, and most of us are more familiar with the film versions of Interview with the Vampire, with the famous Hollywood stars. But I think it's really interesting to think about Anne Rice here and the way that she got involved in writing vampire fiction, and why this ushers in a new kind of period of vampire writing. In the late 1960s, her very young daughter was diagnosed with leukemia and dies. And Anne Rice had begun a writing program, was an inspiring writer, and becomes an alcoholic and self-medicates with drugs and falls into a very deep depression, and as part of coming to terms with that, writes her first short story about a young girl who suffers from a debilitating disease that she can't get out of. She researches a lot about vampires in his time period. She reads Stoker, she reads other pieces as well, and then models a girl vampire after her own daughter. In this tragic story, that is then the basis, and Rice pulls herself out of this depression, in part having written herself out of the depression, and then turns this into a larger story called Interview with the Vampire, which becomes then part of a trilogy, the Vampire Chronicles. And the daughter, Claudia, who is the inspiration for the girl Claudia, the vampire Claudia, is also part of that film. And I think it's really interesting to go back and read this book in terms of a mother's loss of her child and try to come to terms with debilitating illnesses. So I could go on and on and on for hours, but what I'd like to do is end there with I think, because I think after this time period we have a new group of vampires that come in, and I'd like to spend some time with you thinking about those and maybe having a few questions and answers. I have some questions of my own about what kind of vampires do we need now? With Interview with a Vampire and the film version of it, we definitely see a new interest in new media representations of vampires. We see the film itself was very popular. We see the beginnings of other films and that are campy films about vampires, including the film Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which became a cult hit and then became a popular TV series. It's actually the TV series that that pulled me into looking more at vampires in popular culture, not just in terms of 19th century. When I taught at Ohio University a decade ago, my students were always nominating me for awards like most likely to have stayed up too late watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer and not gotten our homework graded. And I think it's a really interesting series in terms of a young girl who is in high school, who's troubled, and yet is able to fight her way out of horrible situations that turn out to be even worse than high school. And as the series goes on, it goes on for many years. We have the emergence of a strong lesbian role model for girls who had not been coded as lesbian at the beginning of the show. But then, that starts off an entire new kind of group of TV shows made for TV pieces like True Blood, based on this Sookie Stackhouse series by Charlene Harris. We also have more recently things like Twilight, which my students love to hate. And in Twilight, of course, the vampires sparkle. They can actually go out into the world and interact with this special sparkly sun interaction piece going. We have some important African American works as well, with Octavia Butler's Fledgling, about a young vampire who is an orphan and has to find her way in the world, and she's quite dark-skinned, and we learn that vampirism is a pigment problem, and that if you have enough pigment in your skin as a vampire, you can actually go out into the world. Octavia Butler does not write much more about vampires per se, but this tension between African American figures in a white society goes on to inform a lot of her work based explicitly on slavery. So these all might seem to look like less authentic vampires. If you look at this one, this is based on a children's book, The Littlest Vampire, Little Vampire, a TV show that comes out for kids and happy-go-lucky vampire family. We have our girl walks home alone at night, billed as being, and I suspect this is true, the first Iranian vampire story. We have one of my favorites, Let the Right One In, from Sweden, about a child vampire who has to be invited in. This is somebody mentioned this earlier as part of what goes on. He's like Claudia in Interview with the Vampire, stuck in a child's body, and has to rely on adults to be able to get to kill vampires or kill humans for him so he can feed. We also have Being Human, a great British TV show, which everyone always says this, but it's true. This British TV show really is better than the American one that came out of Hollywood. What We Do in the Shadows, a mockumentary about vampires, which to the point that we now need a documentary that's actually a fake documentary about vampires. When I ask students at the end of the quarter, what might a vampire look like today? I talked about this past weekend with my spouse, Jonathan Kaplan, who also has co-taught a vampire class with me, and he suggested it would be technology. That technology would be the thing that would suck us all, and perhaps Facebook already was a part of a Zuckerberg vampire complex. My students have suggested an environmental threat would be the real vampire out there that's sucking life away from us. And with that, I'd like to end on some time for questions and comments about what vampires would you make. Yeah, please.
So is this a myth that you find that comes up in other cultures historically? Is it an archetypical thing that you see in other than Western?
It's a really good question. We see vampire-like. If we assume that the idea of a vampire is a monster who represents some sort of fear and has some sort of life-sucking properties, not necessarily blood, not necessarily changing people to live forever. We see this in almost every culture. So there are some, and I'm not an expert in this area, I only know a little bit here, but we see this. There's Louise White wrote a piece called Talking with Vampires, in which she traces vampire stories in every single African country throughout the 18th and 19th century. In one case, she suggests that one tribe has actually seen white colonizers who didn't make it as far as their tribe, and then they create stories to explain these pale-skinned monsters who are doing damage to their world, and it's not exactly but there's enough of a piece there that I think that she's right about that. We see in China there also is a winged figure who has usually a woman who has the possibility of stealing souls and coming back to haunt people until they do something right. And we have a modern, fairly modern vampire in Latin America that came to be a more popular part of vampire culture when I was teaching the class for the first time in the 90s when I was in Ohio, the chupacabra, which was really, it was a vampire that was eating local goats in certain Latin American communities. And one of my students had heard of this and thought it was a funny story, and it was I found a piece in the National Enquirer where you've got this goat-looking thing with red flashing eyes. It's a National Enquirer, not too hard to find these kind of things. And then shortly after that, South Park, the TV show South Park, had a joke about the chupacabra coming and eating Kenny. And then I thought that it was not going to be a real thing. And then after having I was out of the country for a few years before I came to Oregon, and came back and realized that chupacabra was actually something that my students treated as if it were as old as Dracula. So they recreate them all the time.
What do you think of the strain as the environmental /plague/vampire on television?
I don't know it. I haven't watched it. What do you think of it? My students were saying it was, they were split down the middle about whether or not it was something we should be watching next time I teach the class.
I thought,
Yeah.
okay, this is vampire. The stupidity of the doctors, etc., not listening to the man who knows everything.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually, okay, I'll put it on my list for sure. I think that the if we had a Venn diagram, the piece in the middle about but from zombies and vampires would have an awful lot in common. You know, this idea of coming back from the dead and killing other people. And you know, the main piece I think that we see in popular culture for zombies is that they are often portrayed as not being intelligent, not being able to think for themselves anymore, whereas vampires are quite intelligent. But I think that with a show like this, if I understand correctly, the zombies are no longer just thoughtless. They actually have kind of a plan with what they're doing. So I do think that it's hard to say whether or not something's a zombie or a vampire anymore. I think they become kind of the same. Oh, good.
And it made me wonder, was that just tongue-in-cheek, or are there people who really take this that seriously?
So the answer is yes and no. I don't think that people actually are buying guns to kill zombies per se. That said, I do think that the metaphor of, you know, I'm going to kill zombies, I think they have an idea of what is behind that for them, whatever that means. One piece I did not include in my discussion today is that people do, I'm going to be careful how I say this, some people do self-identify as vampires. And we have a group, there was a large group in the 80s of young people, especially in the Los Angeles area, who lived the life, ironically, the undead life of vampires, who believe themselves to be vampires. And they do not believe themselves to be this long line of people who have been infected by other vampires. But they do often have blood rituals, and they live amongst themselves and sometimes believe themselves to need the blood of others to survive. But usually if they're in the interviews, they usually do actually, if you get to it a little bit more, do admit that it's not actually real life survival, but just their mental health is dependent on living in this close-knit community where they all understand each other. The incidence of this group in the 80s especially, almost all of them had been sexually abused as young children. And I think it's a really interesting manifestation of that trauma to become part of this sexualized community where sexual acts are performed for others in this very performative aspect, and but where they control all the rules. There are really strict rules about how you take blood, how you interact with each other. We also there's a really famous vampire in the US named Gremlin, I think, who is a psychic vampire. And he takes, this is really a big surprise. So he really needs, in order to survive, and I think this is actually his pickup line, he needs to have sex in order to have an orgasm in order to be able to continue living. He needs that hit of sexual energy. So, I don't know how often this line works for him, but he's been around for a couple of decades. And he does say that if he can't find somebody to have sex with, he can still get psychic energy. And he describes going to a Starbucks and having really been tired, and this person next to him takes a quadruple shot of espresso, and then the gremlin's able to wake up and really take it, and then the guy next to him is really sad. So, the next time that you're in a coffee shop and that double espresso actually makes you more tired than it should have, it might just be that you're sitting next to a psychic vampire.
And then they're in a big castle, kind of Dracula-esque.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting because it's...
Vampire spoof.
Yeah, I think so, but it comes out at the same time that we have these other camp versions of vampires, right? And thinking about like blaxploitation films or Blacula, the same kind of playing with this scary piece, but also but saying something else about it through this, using the scary trope in a humorous way in order to make a different point about sexuality. Yeah, it's interesting how different tropes of scary things get used humorously to make the same kinds of points, though. So I study East Germany, and East Germany was very well known for its films. It had beautiful filmmaking, really important filmmaking, and it drew absolutely on a tradition of Germany's golden age of filmmaking during the Weimar period. We see, and in fact, the East German Film Production Studio was the Weimar 20s era film production studio, and there's a lot of the same people making these films, same kind of cinematography, the same kind of some of the same actors. They're really beautiful. The one thing that we do not have in East Germany is a remake of Nosferatu, which is very interesting. It gets remade in West Germany in the 70s. To my knowledge, the only reference to a vampire at all in all of the 800 feature films made by East Germany is in a children's film where a policeman, a very funny children's film, it's not scary at all, where a policeman by accident pours hair-growing shampoo on his dog, and this German shepherd becomes a big English shepherd with, a lot of fur, and the dog is named Dracula, and the policeman worries that he won't be scary anymore to the bad guys because he no longer looks like a German shepherd. And it's the only reference I've ever heard of vampire. When I interviewed some East German filmmakers 10 years ago to ask what their thoughts were about that, and they all said, no, we weren't supposed to scare people with things that weren't real. There were enough things that were real in the world to scare people about. The threat of nuclear war, the possibility, lessons from the Holocaust, which of course in East Germany were always not only about anti-Semitism, but also about the fears of being against communists as well. And so I think that's interesting that there were definitely funny, hilarious, humorous camp films in East Germany, but there was never that playing around with monsters in a funny way. So I think that's and also interesting. It's hard to write an article about the films that never were, but if I could, that would be my main country for that one. It's the one example that I know of a community that really definitely rejected scariness on that kind of fantastical level at all. Yeah.
Do werewolves have kind of a parallel history?
Yeah, they do. There's a lovely werewolves and just generally frightening animals in general. There's a 14th century monster, I think it's 14th century, in the Gévaudan in France that shows up and is always eating local villagers and becomes this also fantastical werewolf bear kind of figure in local villagers' minds. And so this discussion, I think if you look at something as early as Red Riding Hood even, and the wolf character in there, it's absolutely somebody who can impersonate a person and comes in and kills them and is quite scary and tricks you. So I think these kinds of animal figures that then are able to become part of the human experience and terrorize people has a parallel discussion going along there at all times. They're also the same similar kinds of ways to kill them, right? Silver bullets with a werewolf. It's silver crosses and chains with vampires. So I think that they're expressions of the same kinds of fears. Is there a question?
Were those created to scare children in order to keep them home and obey? And was there a purpose?
No. Yeah, I think there's a purpose to them. I think they're. I think that they are also always children's tales. They've also always have been, but they're also always. They also always have been stories for adults to tell each other to scare them. And I think that there's some moralizing going on in Red Riding Hood. You should definitely follow your parents' advice. Don't leave the path of pines under the path of needles. And in Hansel and Gretel. Hansel and Gretel, it's very much more a tale of hunger, right? Of starving conditions in rural parts of Central Europe that would have been older than the 19th century. And Hansel and Gretel, I think, is the real tale. Is actually that the parents send the kids off into the wilderness and don't want them to come back, right? Because they can't afford to feed them. So I think in order to make adults assuage adults' feelings about if only I didn't have kids, they come back. But I think probably that tale ends in many ways much more for adults. dealing with the fact that they have 2 more mouths to feed and really resent their children. So, yeah.
I'm curious about the class that you teach.
Mm-hmm.
And is it a part of a literature program?
Mm-hmm.
And what kind of kids are taking it?
Yeah. So when I was at Ohio University about 12 years ago, my students were really aware of the fact that I was working on vampires. I was actually there as their European gender historian. I was the first person to teach gender history for Europe there, and started writing this vampire piece on the side. And my intention had been to write a textbook for a class on vampires, and didn't ever happen. It's on my list of things to do. But I won a teaching award. And I was nominated for a teaching award by students, and then I had to submit a portfolio of why I thought I should get this teaching award. And the prize for it was 2 courses you could teach of your dream. And my students have been pushing me for a while to teach a course in vampires, and there's no good way that my department, which was kind of a very conservative history department, which did, I taught women in gender history, that was enough, right? And so vampires was not going to fly, but then I did win the award, and I had submitted this vampire syllabus as part of it. I put a lot of my students' ideas about how it could be taught into that. So I won the award and I taught it. My initial idea had been that sort of 12 to 15 students who had been with me from the very beginning would be the main audience for this topic. And then Ohio had the football team got to register first, and they all filled all the seats. And I said, okay, I'm not just teaching the football team who think this is going to be an easy A and is going to drop the course after the first week when they realize it's not just like watching movies all the time. And so then we made it bigger, and then pretty soon it was like 30 students, and then it was 50, and then it was 77 students, and we could have probably filled the football stadium with it in the end. And so that was the first time I taught it, and I taught it as a history. It was called a university course, and I taught it as a historical course looking at the history of vampires and myth and text. And so the kind of thing I did today to go over that. I had looked at one era every single week and talked about these monsters in historical context and why we're afraid of them. And then my spouse and I, when we started dating a couple of years ago, that was one of the things we bonded over, was our interest in vampires. He's a philosopher, and he has looked at the ethical problems of having somebody live forever, and whether or not you're responsible to keep up your own. Should you kill other people to save yourself and keep living, on somebody else's blood? And then we said, we really should teach a course one of these days on that. And the Honors College at Oregon State University is uniquely positioned to offer courses that are the kinds of courses that don't fit anywhere nicely. And they're very often experimental courses that professors can apply to teach. And the Honors College has to have it. They have a certain number of small seminars, 12 undergraduate students from all disciplines, and they have to take a certain number of these. They're called colloquia. They're 2 hours a week, and they are primarily discussions. And so we applied to teach one of these. And as an interdisciplinary course, we had 12 students. We taught it for the first time this past fall. We've been asked to teach it again next fall. I always had a little bit of an historical overview, and then my partner Jonathan Kaplan facilitated readings of pieces. We had them read they had a choice of readings for one of their big projects. They could read Dracula. They could also read The Historian by Elizabeth Kosarova, I think is her last name, about an historian who goes and finds a vampire story that her father, who was also an historian, had been working on. They could read the Twilight series, a couple of things like that they did reports on, and we also had them read several short stories. The one that was the most important for me was called Down Among the Dead Men, which is, I can't remember the guy's name right now, but it's a story about just to kind of give you an example of where we're trying to push the class into thinking. It's a short story about a Jewish vampire who is in a concentration camp during the Holocaust and survives by killing other inmates who are about to, in his mind, to die anyway. And the students had a real hard time with that. They really thought it was really hard and really unfair. How could a Jewish vampire kill other Jews even if they were about to die? And that for them was much worse than the Nazi context around them, right? Of course, the Nazis were going to kill the Jews, but then somebody within their own population being a threat to them was really hard for them. We read that. We also read Mouse, the graphic novel by Art Spiegelman. If you don't know it, it's really worth looking at. It's really revolutionized the way that we talk about the Holocaust. We read that in terms, as part of that, discussions about Nazi Germany and racism. So it's called Vampires, Race, and Gender, and it's really more like vampires, race, gender, sexuality, religion. And yeah, so then the students finished a project. So one of the students did, in fact, live out her dream of creating a positive vampire lesbian story that she drew illustrations for. Another student imagined what would happen if all the vampires that she knew of were brought together and were to be judged by some greater moral authority, and what would their punishment be? How many years would they get? How many eternities would they get for what crimes? It was quite lovely. And then we had another student who looked at, there's a mother-daughter scene in Carmilla that she wanted to explore more in terms of tenderness, and how this is also part of that story. So it's a fun course, and I hope to be able to, at some point, to teach it in World Languages and Cultures, which is the program that German is hosted in, as a larger class for 30 or 50 students, and get them introduced to the fact that you can do history with anything. That's really the reason. You can study anything through any lens, and it's sometimes hard for me to get them in other kinds of classes. But something like that, if you can get them in and show them, you can do a history of the universe through something like vampires, and they're actually quite meaningful. Then I can, it's my gateway course, right? So. Gosh, you guys, thank you so much. This has been really fun.